When Trump tried to strip her dignity in front of the entire nation, nobody expected what happened next. The courtroom was alive with a low, restless hum, a sound born from anticipation and unease. Reporters scribbled furiously in notepads, cameras clicked like a swarm of insects, and ordinary citizens packed into the gallery leaned forward as if the air itself might deliver history before their eyes. Every breath seemed to hang heavy in the silence that preceded him. And then, with that familiar swagger, Donald Trump rose to speak. His words dripped with contempt, sharpened like blades designed not to argue facts, but to slice character. He pointed at Jasmine Crockett with a smirk, his voice booming with the bravado of someone who believed the world belonged to him alone. "This," he declared, gesturing toward her, "is the face of incompetence. The proof that people like her have no business standing in a courtroom, no business representing anyone, anywhere." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself faltered. Crockett did not move. She did not flinch. Her eyes remained steady, locked not on the insults but on the man hurling them. Around her, murmurs rose, some in shock, some in outrage, others in the quiet, nervous laughter of those too afraid to stand against power. The judge shifted uncomfortably, tapping a gavel not to restore order but to remind the room that this was still a court of law, not a circus. And yet Trump thrived in circus arenas. He leaned into the noise, reveling in it, his chin lifted high as though the entire nation had already bowed to his performance. The insult was not new, but the cruelty was undeniable. It was not merely about one woman. It was about every immigrant's child who had ever been told they did not belong. Every voice silenced by arrogance, every hand pushed aside by wealth and entitlement. Trump's attack sought to strip away more than Crockett's dignity. It sought to reinforce the lie that only certain people deserved the microphone of justice. But Crockett was not just anyone. And as the last echo of Trump's words lingered in the chamber, a subtle shift occurred. The restless murmurs grew quiet, replaced by an almost sacred anticipation. Because what Crockett was about to do would not simply defend herself, but Crockett's response wouldn't just silence Trump. It would shake the entire court. The courtroom confrontation was not born in isolation. It was the product of months, years, of a political climate poisoned by spectacle, arrogance, and a hunger for power at any cost. For Donald Trump, this was not simply about winning a legal argument. It was about reaffirming his dominance, reminding the world that no matter the stage, he could bend the narrative to his will. And in Jasmine Crockett, he saw something he despised, a woman who stood for everything he could not control. Crockett represented more than a single voice. She symbolized the struggle of those who refused to be silenced, those who carried their identity with pride in a country that too often demanded assimilation without respect. For many in the audience, she was not just an attorney. She was a mirror of themselves, of their families, of generations who had endured ridicule, dismissal, and yet still pressed forward with dignity intact. Trump, ever calculating, understood the optics. If he could humiliate her publicly, he could send a message that pride could be shattered, that truth could be drowned beneath the volume of arrogance. The nation watched with split eyes. To some, Trump remained the untouchable showman, master of chaos, the man who could say the unsayable and walk away unscathed. To others, he was the embodiment of corruption, a bully whose empire of insults was built on the backs of those he demeaned. And caught in that divide was America itself, wrestling with its identity. Would it reward ridicule or respect, spectacle or substance? Every headline leading up to that day sharpened the stakes. Crockett faces off with Trump in historic courtroom clash. Underdog attorney takes on political Goliath. A battle between truth and theater. The framing was irresistible, the tension undeniable, and Trump, never one to resist the spotlight, leaned into it with his trademark performance. He needed to strike first, to dominate the stage before Crockett had the chance to speak. But the deeper story wasn't just about two figures colliding. It was about the cultural undercurrent tugging at America's heart. Immigrant families who had sacrificed everything watched closely, seeing in Crockett the proof that their stories mattered. Young people scrolling through endless streams of political noise paused when her name appeared, curious to see if authenticity could still cut through chaos. And for those long disillusioned by politics, this moment felt like a test. Was the system entirely broken, or could dignity still pierce through the rot of corruption? Trump's calculation was cruel but clear. He knew that targeting Crockett meant targeting an idea larger than her. It meant reminding every person of color, every woman, every working-class fighter, that they could be dragged into the mud and mocked without mercy. He sought not just to win the day, but to stain the symbol she represented. And yet that very strategy revealed his weakness. By striking at her identity, he elevated the stakes beyond his control. Because now, the battle was no longer just his insult against her composure. It was arrogance against truth. It was corruption against justice. It was ridicule against respect. And the entire nation, whether in that courtroom, at home on their couches, or scrolling through their phones, felt the weight of what was unfolding. Trump thought he had written the script. But what he underestimated was that Crockett's story was not his to narrate. She carried too many voices, too many histories, too much quiet power to be reduced to a punchline. To understand why Trump struck first, we have to look deeper at his pattern of attacks. From the very beginning of his public life, Donald Trump built his reputation not on quiet achievement, but on spectacle. He was less a politician or businessman than a showman, one who understood that headlines mattered more than results, and insults often traveled farther than truth. The courtroom on that day was merely his latest stage. But the performance was familiar. Decades earlier, reporters had learned to expect the bombast, the flailing hands, the jutting jaw, the swagger that bordered on parody. He spoke in absolutes, branding his enemies with schoolyard nicknames: Crooked Hillary, Little Marco, Sleepy Joe. Each phrase was designed not to argue, but to humiliate, to reduce complex opponents into cartoon characters that existed only to fuel his dominance. It worked because he never sought to win debates through evidence. He sought to win through ridicule. The more outrageous the insult, the more attention it attracted, and for Trump, attention was the only currency that mattered. In his rallies, the tactic became ritual. Crowds cheered not when he laid out policy, but when he mocked someone's appearance, someone's accent, someone's dignity. The performance was never about ideas. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy where he stood above and everyone else bent beneath. Each insult became a weapon. Each exaggeration a way of proving that truth itself was irrelevant, as long as his voice was loud enough to drown it out. When the court cases began to pile up, investigations into business dealings, political maneuverings, and the chaos of his presidency, he carried the same showmanship into the legal arena. For Trump, a courtroom was not a place of solemn accountability. It was a theater with a captive audience. He would arrive with grand gestures, wave to cameras as though they were his loyal fans, and treat prosecutors, judges, and even jurors as extras in his one-man show. Every objection, every ruling, every question became another opportunity for performance. He thrived on the chaos. Judges who sought to restrain him often found themselves mocked outside the courthouse, their names dragged into his speeches. Prosecutors were branded as radical, witch hunters, enemies of the people. In Trump's world, the law was not a system of justice. It was a stage upon which he could recast himself as the persecuted hero and his opponents as villains. He blurred the lines until truth and fiction became indistinguishable, leaving only the story he wanted his followers to believe, and arrogance was always at the heart of it. Trump did not simply believe he was right. He believed he was untouchable. Every scandal that failed to bring him down, every lawsuit that dragged on without consequence, reinforced his conviction that he could never truly lose. He saw the world as divided into winners and losers, and in his mind, he had always been the ultimate winner. Anyone who challenged him was not an opponent to be debated, but an enemy to be crushed, mocked, and dismissed. This arrogance blinded him. He mistook fear for respect, applause for loyalty, silence for consent. He believed that if he insulted loudly enough, if he performed brazenly enough, others would cower, and too often they did. Opponents froze under the barrage of mockery, unsure how to respond to a man who wielded shamelessness as a weapon. His strategy was not subtle, but it was effective. For years, he steamrolled through debates, dominated news cycles, and turned even the gravest legal proceedings into carnival acts. The montage of his career played like a reel of arrogance, standing at podiums with exaggerated gestures, sneering into cameras, pointing fingers at those who dared question him. Each scandal became another scene in the endless performance. Bankruptcies spun into tales of genius, affairs reframed as witch hunts, impeachments cast as badges of honor. Trump was not content with surviving controversy. He demanded to be celebrated for it, and so, when he turned his focus toward Jasmine Crockett, he carried with him the same script he had used for decades: belittle, mock, dominate. He saw in her not a formidable opponent, but just another target, another name to twist into a jeer, another face to reduce into a caricature. In his arrogance, he assumed she would wilt beneath the pressure, that the weight of his insults would crush her spirit as it had so many others before. But Trump was about to face a reality he had never prepared for. Because Crockett was not like the others Trump had steamrolled before. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stood in that courtroom, before her name appeared in headlines beside Trump's, she was a young girl in Texas who understood what it meant to be overlooked. She was born into a world that often measured people by the color of their skin, the depth of their pockets, or the privilege of their last names. But Crockett's story was not one of privilege. It was one of grit. Her parents raised her on lessons that carried more weight than gold. Work hard, stay honest, defend what's right even when it's difficult. These were not empty words, but lived realities. She grew up watching neighbors fight to keep food on the table, watching friends stumble when doors were shut simply because of who they were. Crockett absorbed it all: the inequities, the quiet sacrifices, the strength of communities who refused to give up. She did not set out to chase the spotlight. Law, for her, was never about glamour or prestige. It was about giving voice to those who had been silenced. When she became an attorney, her clients were not the powerful. They were the vulnerable. She stood beside people who couldn't afford flashy lawyers, who were often told the system wasn't built for them. In crowded courtrooms and late-night offices, she became their shield. Every case was more than paperwork. It was a fight for dignity. The sacrifices were countless. While others pursued lucrative paths, Crockett poured herself into advocacy that rarely paid and often demanded more than any single person should have to give. There were nights when she questioned whether the work was breaking her. The endless uphill battles, the smears, the exhaustion. Yet each time she considered retreat, she thought of the people counting on her. Quitting was never an option. Her rise into public service wasn't accidental. It was born out of necessity. She had witnessed too much injustice to remain on the sidelines. Elected office was not a crown she sought, but a tool she wielded, a platform to fight not just for her clients, but for entire communities left behind by broken systems. And in that role, she carried herself with a mix of grace and fire, calm when calm was required, unflinching when lines needed to be drawn. Crockett's journey was littered with challenges. There were opponents who underestimated her, who dismissed her as too young, too radical, too different. There were whispers meant to undermine her credibility, headlines crafted to diminish her impact. Yet she endured it all with composure. Each insult sharpened her resolve. Each setback fortified her character. Her quiet strength became her armor. In debates and hearings, her presence was unmistakable. She did not shout to be heard. Instead, she wielded words like precision tools, cutting through arrogance with logic, exposing hypocrisy with calm conviction. Where others tried to overwhelm with noise, she disarmed with truth. And those who truly listened could feel it. Her voice carried not just argument, but lived experience. She was not speaking from theory. She was speaking from the marrow of her life, from the struggles of those she represented, from the sacrifices of her community, for immigrant families, for working-class parents, for young women dreaming of breaking ceilings stacked high against them. Crockett embodied possibility. She was proof that one could rise without surrendering identity, proof that dignity could survive the storm. She was not polished in the way Washington often demanded, and that was precisely why she resonated. She was real, unbent, unwilling to play the role of anyone's pawn. And so, when her path inevitably crossed with Trump's, the contrast could not have been sharper. Here was a man who had built his empire on arrogance, on belittling, on spectacle. And here was a woman who had built her life on service, sacrifice, and unshakable principle. Trump believed he had seen opponents like her before, people who would crumble under his insults. What he failed to see was that Crockett had weathered storms far harsher than his words. She had already proven herself in battles most Americans would never even glimpse, fighting for families who could not afford to fight for themselves, standing in rooms where her presence was not welcomed, pressing forward when everything told her to stop. Every trial had prepared her for this moment. Every slight, every dismissal, every grueling fight had forged her into something far stronger than Trump could ever imagine. Her composure was not weakness, it was mastery. Her calm was not passivity, it was power. And as the eyes of the nation fixed upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to Trump's attack, they did not know they were watching the culmination of a lifetime of battles. Crockett was not merely defending herself. She was carrying every lesson, every sacrifice, every voice that had shaped her into this moment of truth, and it was that quiet strength that Trump would fatally underestimate. The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law. It had transformed into Trump's stage. He leaned forward over the lectern, jabbing his finger in Crockett's direction, as though his words alone could pin her to the wall. His voice thundered, bouncing off the marble and wood, filling the air with a mix of anger and derision. "She's a fraud!" he barked. "A complete disgrace. Look at her, unqualified, unfit, and only here because the system is broken." Everyone knows it. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some jurors averted their eyes, their discomfort written in the way their hands tightened against the wooden arms of their chairs. A reporter near the back whispered into a recorder, catching every syllable of Trump's tirade. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of fear and anticipation, the tension so sharp it could almost be heard. Trump was relentless. Every pause was filled not with reflection but with another jab, another insult, another attempt to grind his opponent into dust. "This is what America's become," he sneered, his face flushed red beneath the bright lights. "People like her trying to tell the rest of us how to live, how to think, how to act. It's pathetic, absolutely pathetic." His hand slapped the edge of the podium, the crack of skin on wood echoing through the room. The jurors shifted again. One adjusted their glasses nervously. Another wiped a bead of sweat that had gathered on their brow. Even the judge, stone-faced and restrained, cleared his throat as though to remind Trump of decorum. Yet the former president plowed on, impervious to restraint, intoxicated by the sound of his own fury. And through it all, Crockett sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, chin lifted, her eyes fixed on him with a composure that unnerved even those watching. She did not roll her eyes. She did not scoff. She did not interrupt. Her silence was a blade sharper than any insult he hurled. Where Trump's voice cracked with anger, hers carried only calm. Though she had not yet spoken a word, the murmurs began to ripple across the gallery. A woman in the second row whispered, "Why isn't she saying anything?" A man beside her shook his head, watching the storm unfold. On social media, the live tweets flew like sparks, Trump tearing into Crockett. "She's not moving an inch. This is brutal." The tension was unbearable, as if the entire country leaned closer to the edge of their seats, waiting for something to give. Trump's confidence swelled. He mistook her silence for weakness, her composure for defeat. He grinned between his accusations, sensing victory, feeding on the discomfort in the room. "See? She's got nothing," he gloated, spreading his arms wide as if to invite the audience into his conclusion. "No defense, no argument, nothing but lies. That's why she's sitting there like a statue. Because deep down she knows I'm right." But if Trump believed silence was surrender, he had misread the moment entirely. The stillness around Crockett was not emptiness. It was power gathering, a storm holding back until the exact moment it was ready to break. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench. "Order!" he called, his voice cutting through the noise, though even he looked uncertain of how much control he still held. Trump smirked, brushing it off, tapping the microphone as though the court itself belonged to him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a sneer that seemed designed for humiliation rather than persuasion. "You don't belong here, Jasmine. You never did. And soon everybody's going to see it." The words lingered like smoke, foul and suffocating. The gallery fell into stunned silence, the air thick with the weight of the insult. All eyes shifted to Crockett. For the first time that afternoon, the energy of the room did not rest on Trump's booming voice, but on the quiet figure who had absorbed every blow without flinching. She unfolded her hands slowly, her movements deliberate, measured, as though time itself had slowed to make way for what was coming. The murmurs ceased, the shifting chairs stilled, even the cameras seemed to hold their click. But then, Crockett stood up, and the entire energy of the room shifted. The moment had ripened like a storm, the silence before the thunder. Trump's voice had just finished ricocheting across the courtroom, booming, brash, dripping with insult. He leaned back with that familiar smirk, the one designed to say, "I've already won." His finger still half-pointed, his eyes darting toward the press gallery, as if to confirm that the cameras had caught his latest show of dominance. But then, Crockett rose. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble over papers or shuffle nervously. She simply pushed her chair back with a soft scrape against the courtroom floor, stood, and adjusted the lapel of her suit. The room seemed to inhale with her. Every pair of eyes pulled magnetically in her direction. Hands folded at her waist, she allowed the silence to linger, to stretch into something thick and electric. Trump's smirk faltered just slightly, because he had seen this look before, though never aimed at him. It was the look of someone who wasn't about to fight on his terms, someone who wasn't here to be humiliated. "Mr. Trump," Crockett began, her voice measured, calm, each word landing with weight. "You've spent years trying to rewrite the truth with volume and insults. But facts do not bend to ego." A ripple spread through the audience. Even the stenographer's fingers seemed to pause on the keys. Crockett didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Instead, she drew out her words like a scalpel, precise and cutting. "You accuse me of dishonesty," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "Yet your own record is littered with lies so numerous they fill volumes. Judges, juries, and the American people have witnessed them firsthand." Trump shifted in his chair. His hand twitched at the armrest, and for the first time in the hearing, he didn't interrupt. Perhaps it was the certainty in her tone, or the awareness that the cameras now swung in her direction. Crockett turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the room. "This isn't about me. This is about a pattern. A man who has called immigrants criminals, women weak, and the truth inconvenient. A man who believes that if he shouts loudly enough, reality itself will yield." Gasps, murmurs. A juror leaned forward, chin resting on his knuckles, riveted. Crockett paused, deliberately. She let the moment breathe. Then she struck again. "You claim to be the defender of the people, Mr. Trump. Yet when working families struggled, you handed tax breaks to billionaires. When women demanded dignity, you mocked them on stages. When our democracy demanded honor, you tried to bend it to your will. And now, here, in this court, you think you can strip me of mine. But let me be clear. My dignity does not come from your approval. It comes from every person who has ever been told they are less than and still stood tall." The room erupted in a hushed exhale, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it knows it has witnessed something irreversible. Trump's smirk was gone. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff. Crockett leaned slightly toward him, her voice still steady, but now sharpened with conviction. "You call me dishonest? I wear the scars of service, of struggle, of defending those who cannot defend themselves. What do you wear, Mr. Trump? The weight of your bankruptcies? The stain of your cruelty? The echo of your own arrogance?" Every sentence landed like a hammer. Trump's eyes flicked toward the judge, toward the cameras, then back to Crockett. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Crockett pressed forward, her hand rising, palm open, as if to place a mirror before him. For years, you've survived by steamrolling, by turning debates into circus acts, by convincing people that strength is the same as shouting. But strength is this: standing in truth, standing in dignity, standing without fear of your ridicule. The judge leaned forward slightly, lips pursed, nodding almost imperceptibly. Even the court officers, trained to remain impassive, could not hide the flicker of admiration in their eyes. Then came the final blow. The mic drop moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts. Retweeted across the internet, etched into memory. "Mr. Trump," Crockett said, lowering her voice until the courtroom strained to catch it. "You do not decide my worth. You never have. And after today, the world will know. You cannot strip dignity from those who refuse to bow to your arrogance." She stepped back. Silence. A silence so profound it seemed to vibrate. And then, like a dam breaking, the room shifted. A gasp from the gallery. A muffled "that's right" from somewhere in the back. Jurors glanced at each other with raised brows. Even the judge tapped his gavel once, not to scold, but to steady the rising tide of emotion in the chamber. Trump sat frozen, the bravado drained from his face. For once, he wasn't the center of the theater. He was the man caught in it, exposed, dismantled, diminished. Crockett returned to her seat, calm as she had risen. Hands folded again, her expression serene, as though she had merely spoken an ordinary truth. The contrast was devastating. Trump, flustered and fuming, tapped his fingers impatiently, his mouth a tight line. But the damage was done. The cameras had caught it all. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just live in a courtroom. It spreads. It resonates. It takes on a life of its own. And as the murmurs filled the air, as reporters scribbled furiously and phones buzzed with breaking alerts, there was no mistaking it. Crockett had just altered the trajectory of the confrontation. But the shock waves didn't stop in that courtroom. The courtroom moment didn't end when the gavel struck. It began there. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to their cameras as though the ground itself had shifted. Within minutes, the first clip of Crockett's takedown hit Twitter. By the time it was reposted once, it was already everywhere. Hashtags surged. Crockett crushes Trump, Haas dignity over arrogance, mic drop moment. Trending in every major city, the wave was unstoppable. On TikTok, teenagers remixed the moment, overlaying Crockett's words with cinematic soundtracks, violins swelling, bass drops punctuating her final lines. On Instagram, artists sketched digital portraits of her standing tall, head held high, while Trump slumped in the background. The images spread like wildfire, each one captioned with her defining sentence: "You do not decide my worth." Cable news caught up within the hour. MSNBC rolled her words on loop, the chyron blazing. Crockett delivers stunning courtroom takedown. CNN played it side by side with Trump's expression as her speech landed, the fade of his smirk replayed in slow motion again and again. Even Fox News, usually protective of Trump, couldn't ignore it. Their commentators struggled to spin the exchange, their voices cracking as they downplayed what millions had already seen. By nightfall, the clip had been viewed 50 million times. Ordinary people felt it in their bones. At dinner tables across America, families huddled around phones and laptops, watching Crockett speak as though she were speaking for them. Parents leaned over to their children and said, "See? That's strength. That's what courage looks like." In immigrant households, her words echoed even deeper. A reminder that dignity was not granted by powerful men, but earned through struggle and never surrendered. Memes erupted too. Twitter lit up with gifs of Trump's smirk dissolving, paired with captions like "when the boss catches you lying at work," or "when mom says because I said so and you've got no comeback." Humor and triumph blended into a cultural crescendo. But it wasn't just online. On the late-night shows, hosts dedicated entire monologues to Crockett's moment. One quipped, "Trump's been in a lot of courts, but this is the first time he walked out wishing it was monopoly money at stake." Laughter roared. But underneath it was admiration. Admiration for the woman who had faced the bluster and come out unshaken. In coffee shops, strangers struck up conversations. "Did you see what Crockett did?" At barbershops, people replayed the clip like it was the highlight reel of a championship game. And for those who had felt dismissed, mocked, or belittled by Trump's years of insults, the moment carried something larger: vindication. Even celebrities joined in. A-list actors tweeted their praise. Musicians shared clips during concerts, flashing Crockett's words on giant LED screens. One NBA star posted on Instagram, "This is bigger than politics. This is respect. Period." Meanwhile, Trump's silence became louder than any statement he could have made. Normally quick to rage on Truth Social, he hesitated. His team released a short defensive note, but it only fueled the fire. Screenshots of the post were mocked within minutes, overshadowed by Crockett's words, which rang with clarity against his defensiveness. Commentators noted the shift. "This isn't just a courtroom exchange," one analyst said on primetime TV. "This is a cultural flashpoint. Crockett has turned the tables. She's taken Trump's playbook of theater and spectacle and rewritten it with truth." And so the shockwaves rippled. In marches, on posters, on bumper stickers, Crockett's phrase became a rallying cry. "You do not decide my worth." It was chanted at rallies, painted on walls, shared in classrooms. The courtroom scene had escaped its walls and planted itself in the consciousness of a nation, because in the end, it wasn't only Crockett's win. It was personal for everyone who had ever been silenced, mocked, or told to know their place. It was validation. It was victory. It was a reminder that arrogance could be broken, not by shouting louder, but by standing taller. And while Trump retreated in silence, Crockett stepped forward with a message larger than herself. The storm of noise had passed, the jeers, the smirks, the insults. What remained was not Trump's bluster, but Crockett's voice, still echoing far beyond the courtroom. When she rose again to speak, there was no venom, no gloating. Her words weren't sharpened to wound, but softened to heal. She did not need to destroy. She needed only to remind. "Mr. Trump tried to strip me of my dignity," she said, her tone deliberate, almost reflective. "But dignity isn't his to give or take. It belongs to each of us. Every immigrant who built a life from nothing, every worker who sacrificed for their family, every woman who refused to be silenced, every citizen who holds on to hope when it seems easier to despair." The courtroom leaned in as though the weight of her truth pulled them forward. Even those who had come expecting a spectacle found themselves instead drawn into something greater, a moment of clarity. She went on. "Power built on arrogance is fragile. It crumbles when confronted by truth. But power built on integrity, on service, on love for people greater than yourself, that power endures." It was no longer a rebuttal to Trump. It was a sermon to the nation. A reminder that politics is not only theater, but the measure of character. That leadership is not defined by dominance, but by compassion. "You see," Crockett continued, her eyes scanning the gallery, "this isn't about me and Mr. Trump. It never was. It's about us. It's about whether we, as Americans, believe that cruelty should be rewarded, or that kindness and courage can still light the way forward." A hush blanketed the room. Some clutched their chests. Others simply nodded, as though agreeing with a truth they had known but needed to hear again. "History remembers moments like this," she said, "not because of who shouted the loudest, but because of who stood tallest. Generations will ask what we chose to honor in this time: arrogance or dignity, lies or truth, division or unity." Her words swelled like the closing chords of a symphony, carrying the audience with them. And then the crescendo. "The lesson is simple. You can try to silence me. You can mock me. You can throw every insult you can conjure. But you cannot erase truth. You cannot erase dignity. And you cannot erase the people who know their worth." The judge bowed his head slightly. Jurors exchanged glances heavy with thought. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman wiped a tear. Because Crockett had done more than dismantle Trump's attack, she had transformed it. What began as an attempt to humiliate her had become an anthem for millions watching, proof that light can cut through even the loudest dark. And as her voice fell quiet, the silence was not emptiness but reverence, the kind of silence that carries forward, that lingers in the mind long after the sound has gone. But the question remains: will America listen? When Trump tried to expose Crockett, he expected another victory lap, another moment where his insults would dominate the headlines. Instead, he ignited the very fire that burned through his own arrogance. What was meant to humiliate became history. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended the principle that every person's worth is unshakable, no matter how loudly hate tries to shout it down. And that is why this moment matters. It's not just about a courtroom. It's about America. It's about choosing whether we allow fear and division to define us, or whether we rise above and stand for dignity, truth, and justice. Crockett's stand wasn't hers alone. It was ours. If you felt that power, if you saw yourself in her words, then you are part of this story too. Her courage is a reminder that we are never voiceless, never powerless, and never at the mercy of arrogance, not when we stand together. So here's the call. Don't let this moment fade. Share it, talk about it, carry it into your own conversations, your own communities, your own lives. Because dignity over hate is not just Crockett's message, it's a movement. And if you believe in that movement, join us here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story that matters. Share this video with someone who needs to feel that reminder of strength. And above all, remember, our worth is not defined by those who seek to diminish it. Our worth is ours. And when we stand tall, the whole world takes notice. This is more than a story. It's a stand. And the stand continues with you.